Good morning, friends. Having got introduced with S.G. Coleridge and his life and works during the last lecture, we shall now go ahead with his work of criticism. We are going to deal with biography and literature. Of course, not the entire work, but two chapters from this particular critical work by S.T. Coleridge. We shall be talking about chapter 13 and 14 from his book Biographia Literaria. Now let's try to understand the meaning of the word Biographia Literaria, the title of the book. Biographia Literaria, which literary means by literary biography. This is the Latin title, so you can easily understand that the, the title means literary biography. And this literary biography was written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge with the title Biographia Literaria. While talking about the full title of this particular literary work, critical work, a work of criticism by S.T. Coleridge, we need to understand that the full title of this book was Biographia Literaria, or Biographical Sketches of My Literary Life and Opinions. So the word "my" itself suggests that this work is autobiographical by nature. So Biographia Literaria is an autobiography in discourse by Coleridge. This work was published in the year 1817 in two volumes, and these two volumes consisted of 23 chapters. Now, what could be the reason behind writing this particular text on criticism? One of the reasons why Coleridge's text on criticism is so far famous is because he's able to show a absolute understanding of the relative merits of various poets as he reflects on his own education. So it talks about the merits of different poets. When you look at the full title of this particular text on criticism, we understand that Coleridge is trying to draw sketches of his own literary life and opinions. He talks about himself at the same time he talks about the poets around him, and he focuses on the relative merits of these poets. Further, there is a comment on faculty of imagination. Coleridge explains this faculty of imagination in this literary work or in this text on criticism. In this particular text of criticism, Coleridge discussed not only literature but also many different aspects, variables that influence and inspire writers. So he does not simply talk about poetry or any other form of literature. He goes beyond that. He talks about different aspects which influence and inspire writers while writing a particular literary work. In this particular text of criticism, Coleridge expresses his own thoughts, of course, from personal point of view. He states, "My literary life and opinions." So here, the views expressed are personal. He expresses his own thoughts from a personal point of view. While talking about literature, he also touches upon issues like politics, religion, social values, and human identity. And his treatment of these issues tend to be conservative in judgment, and it's so blatant and original. Now we shall go ahead with the discussion on chapter 13 of the Biographia Literaria. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to talk about two chapters from this book, and the first chapter that we are going to talk about is chapter 13. So there is a letter in chapter 13 of the Biographia Literaria, which is very significant in understanding because it is in this letter that Coleridge sets out his famous distinction between primary and secondary imagination while talking about imagination. He talks about two types of imagination. So this letter therefore becomes significant in understanding this particular distinction being taught by S.T. Coleridge. Now let's try to understand what the primary imagination is. In simple words, the primary imagination makes sense of the world around us. Means what exactly? As you know, that we perceive the world by using our five senses. And whatever sense of the world we make is primary imagination according to Coleridge. Is when we see a flower and we understand that it is a flower, or when we see some animal, some other object, when we hear some sound, when we taste something, when we feel with the help of our skin, that tactile experience, or when we smell something, what we do exactly is we make sense of the world around us, and that is what the primary imagination is. So let's try to understand the two different types of imagination that Coleridge touches upon here. For Coleridge, primary imagination is the living power and prime agent of all human perception. As we understood just now, that the sense of the world that we make is primary imagination. And this primary imagination is the living power and prime agent of all human perception. What is secondary imagination then? The secondary imagination is an echo of the primary imagination. It is an echo. You must be knowing the term echo. Now, echo is the repetition of a sound, and primary imagination is nothing but the repetition of secondary imagination. I mean to say, is the repetition of primary imagination. It is an echo of the primary imagination. However, it differs from the primary imagination in degree and in the mode of operation. Although it is an echo of the primary imagination, secondary imagination differs from primary imagination in terms of its degree and mode of operation. Now, let's be specific about our understanding of secondary imagination. We understood that primary imagination is the living power and prime agent of all human perception. You cannot imagine the world without your eyes, ears, without your ability to taste, without your ability to smell something, or without your ability to feel the touch. So that is a primary imagination. It is the living power. We cannot imagine our life without these senses. And we perceive the world with the help of these senses. However, secondary imagination is different from primary imagination in degree and in the mode of operation. So we are trying to understand what it means specifically. Secondary imagination is a kind of process. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate or to idealize and identify. So this is a kind of chemical process that happens within. It is the process of recreation. And in this process of recreation, different things, different steps are involved. So there is a kind of dissolving process, diffusing process, and there is a kind of dissipation as well. So secondary imagination is the process of recreation, the process that idealizes and identifies your perception, whatever you see, whatever you understand, whatever you comprehend through your senses is primary imagination, but secondary imagination is a kind of processing. It does a kind of process on this perception, your primary imagination, and therein the recreation takes place. So it dissolves, diffuses, and dissipates. So secondary imagination refers to the functions of memory and mental interpretation of sensory data into meaning within the mind. So what is secondary imagination? It is something which refers to the functions of memory. When you see something that is stored in a memory, and within your memory, you go for the interpretation of this data or this sensory data, and you try to give meaning to that particular data within the mind itself. So, in Coleridge's view, the secondary imagination is essentially vital. It is as vital as all objects, whether they are fixed and dead, which are actually fixed and dead. So we may understand that the secondary imagination is something which is pliable and malleable on the voluntary, that is conscious or subconscious level, as in dreams. Means what it functions on the conscious and subconscious level. We see something around us and we start thinking about it. So this keeps happening on a subconscious level as well. As what? As in dreams. Now we refer to something called interpretation of the senses. Coleridge uses the term fancy to elaborate his ideas more effectively in a more appealing manner. He talks about fancy. What is fancy? Fancy is a mode of memory which is free from the order of time and space, which is emancipated from the order of time and space, means free from time and space. Means we can say it is timeless and it cannot be restricted to particular space. Fancy is a mode of memory blended with and modified by that empirical phenomena of the being, that is choice. So it is blended with and modified by the will, the choice of the person. And this seems to be what we mean by imagination. Imagination means to use the mind's eye or ear. We use the mind's eye. We see through by not by our physical eyes. Metaphorically, we see through the mind's eye. We hear something not by our ears, but we hear within our mind. That is our mind's ear, by our mind's ear. Imagination means to stimulate other sensation of something that might be absent or non-existent. Now let me elaborate it. Suppose you see a flower, so you perceive it as a flower. Suppose let's say that flower is a rose, that is your perception. But beyond that, when you try to understand, reinterpret the meaning of the rose itself within your mind, you start seeing its beauty. That is what your secondary imagination is. And imagination is nothing but to use the mind's eye or ear. It is to stimulate, to make another sensation of something that might not be present when you see that thing in the actual world. So all materials are ready-made from the law of association. We associate something to something else. When you read a poem by Robert Burns, my love is a red, red rose. So what a poet is trying to do it, what the speaker is trying to do here, is trying to associate something to something else. So this is what law of association is, and this happens through our imagination. So while talking about interpretation of the senses, Coleridge seems to be saying that one can use fancy as a kind of power to create memory. Memory is a kind of mosaic or collages. There are different things in your memory. It's just like a mosaic. You must have seen mosaic. Mosaic is a kind of design in which you have got different designs are blended together. Or you must be knowing something called collage. Collage is the blending of different pictures, etc. So fancy is a kind of power to create memory, mosaics or collages. It is a process of rearranging what we have experienced into a new combination. Or it is something to say to suit our fancy. That is in a common means fancy. That means we try to save that thing to our particular imagination. So imagination is an let's use Coleridge's term here, a simplistic power, a simplistic power. So Norton, he is well known for his works of criticism, says that the phrase is Coleridge's coinage. That the phrase is simplistic power was coined by Coleridge. Coinage means to find a new word, to discover a new word, to invent a new word. So the phrase a simplistic power is Coleridge's coinage and is built from root words to mean that imagination has a power to mold into unity. Plastic, it has a plasticity. It has a power to mold into unity. So imagination is an plastic power. It has a power to mold into unity. That's what he's trying to uh, interpret. He is trying to explain here what he means by imagination. In my next lecture, I shall further elaborate the terms primary imagination, secondary imagination, and fancy. For the time being, we should stop for now. Thank you.